The Static Man. It was a quiet night when Alex sat down to watch TV. His parents were already asleep, and the house was silent. The only light came from the glow of the television screen. He grabbed the remote and flipped through the channels, but nothing seemed interesting. Ugh, nothing good on, he muttered to himself. He was about to turn the TV off when he stopped on an old movie channel. It was playing some black and white film that looked ancient. He wasn't really in the mood to watch it, but at least it was something. So, he put the remote down and leaned back on the couch. Then, suddenly, the screen filled with static. The sudden burst of white noise made him jump. He frowned and reached for the remote. He pressed the buttons, trying to change the channel, but the screen stayed the same. Just endless static, the white and black fuzz dancing across the screen. What the? He said, pressing the power button. The TV didn't turn off. A cold chill ran down his spine. He pressed the button harder, clicking it again and again, but the screen refused to change. He reached over and tried the buttons on the TV itself, but nothing worked. Then, something appeared in the static. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but as he stared, he realized the static was shifting. A shape was forming, a shadowy figure. His breath caught in his throat. He blinked, hoping his eyes were playing tricks on him. But when he opened them again, the figure was still there. It was tall and dark, and though he couldn't make out any features, he could feel it staring at him. Then, the whisper came. Alex. His name crackled through the static, deep and distorted. His body froze. He felt the hairs on his arms stand up. Nope, he said, trying to shake off his fear. This is just some weird glitch. But he couldn't move. He just stared at the figure, watching as it slowly began to shift. It was moving, getting closer. He scrambled for the remote, his hands shaking. He pressed every button, trying to turn the TV off, trying to do something. The screen finally went black. He let out a shaky breath. The TV was off. Everything was fine. But then, in the dark screen, he saw his reflection. And standing behind him was the shadow. He spun around so fast he nearly fell off the couch. But there was nothing there. The room was empty. Just him, the couch, and the quiet hum of the house. His heart pounded in his chest. He turned back to the TV. His pale face stared back at him. But there was nothing else. No shadow. Okay, he whispered to himself. I'm just tired. Just imagining things. He turned the TV back on. The static was gone. Now, the old movie was playing again, just as if nothing had happened. Alex let out a nervous laugh. Yeah, I'm just being paranoid. He shook his head, grabbed a blanket, and settled in. But later that night, as he lay in bed, he heard it. The soft crackling of static. His eyes snapped open. He turned his head toward the TV in his room. It was on, but he hadn't turned it on. His stomach twisted. He reached for the remote on his nightstand, his fingers trembling. He pressed the power button. The TV didn't turn off. The static continued, filling the room with its eerie white noise. And then, just like before, a shape began to form in the static. The shadowy figure. Only this time, it was clearer, closer. And then, that same distorted voice crackled through the TV. Alex. He threw the blanket off and bolted for the door. He yanked it open and ran down the hall, his heart slamming in his chest. Mom! Dad! He called out. He reached their bedroom and pushed the door open. They were asleep, peaceful, and undisturbed. He hesitated. He didn't want to wake them over nothing. Maybe he was just having a nightmare. Maybe he really was paranoid. Taking a deep breath, he turned back toward his room. The TV was off. The silence in his room felt heavy, like the air was thick with something unseen. He walked cautiously inside, his eyes darting around. Everything looked normal. The posters on the wall, the pile of clothes on the chair, his desk, his books. Everything was exactly as it should be. He let out a slow breath. Maybe it was just a dream. He climbed back into bed, pulling the blankets up to his chin. For a while, everything was fine. The house was silent again, and his body began to relax. Then, just as he was drifting off, he heard it, a whisper, right next to his ear. Alex. His body went ice cold. He didn't move, didn't breathe. Slowly, he turned his head toward the TV. It was on again. The shadow wasn't in the screen anymore. It was standing at the foot of his bed. His breath caught in his throat. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow loomed over him, shifting, its form flickering like it was part of the static itself. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the TV shut off. The room was silent. The shadow was gone. For a long time, Alex lay there, too afraid to move. Morning came, and the fear from the night before felt like a distant dream. But the uneasy feeling never left him. That evening, he avoided the TV. He stayed in the living room with his parents, pretending to do homework. He didn't tell them about what happened. They wouldn't believe him anyway. But that night, when he went to bed, he made sure to unplug the TV. Hours later, he woke up. The room was dark. The house was quiet. He turned over, ready to fall back asleep. Then, static. He sat up so fast his head spun. His heart pounded in his ears. The TV was on, but it was unplugged. A lump formed in his throat. He turned his head slowly toward the screen. The shadow was back. But now, it was different. It wasn't inside the TV anymore. It was standing in the middle of his room, watching him. Alex opened his mouth to scream, but before he could make a sound, the shadow lunged at him. The world went black. The next morning, his parents found his room empty. The bed was unmade. The window was open, letting in the cold morning air. The only thing left was the TV, buzzing softly with static. The stuck channel Emma loved watching late-night talk shows. It was her way to unwind after a long day at work. She would grab a blanket, make a cup of tea, and settle onto the couch, letting the soft glow of the TV keep her company as she listened to funny interviews and monologues. One evening, she did the same thing. She changed into her comfortable pajamas, wrapped herself in a blanket, and picked up the remote. The TV clicked on, and she smiled as the familiar sound of the late-night host's voice filled the room. But something was wrong. The remote wasn't working. She pressed the buttons, but nothing happened. She tried to change the channel, but the screen remained frozen. The volume wouldn't adjust either. Annoyed, Emma smacked the remote against her palm, hoping it was just low on battery. Then the screen flickered. The talk show disappeared, replaced by a blurry black and white broadcast. The image was grainy, the kind you'd see in old movies. Emma frowned. Had she accidentally switched to some vintage channel? On the screen, a man sat in a chair, staring straight ahead. He wasn't moving. His face was pale, his eyes dark and sunken. His expression was empty, almost lifeless. The static around him made it hard to see any details. but he looked old-fashioned, like someone from decades ago. Emma pressed the power button. Nothing. She tried the buttons again, shaking the remote. Still nothing. Then, suddenly, the man on the screen smiled. Emma froze. His lips curled up slowly, unnaturally, as if he wasn't used to smiling. The eerie grin stretched across his face, his teeth slightly crooked, his lips dry and cracked. "Why are you watching me?" he asked. Emma's breath hitched. The voice was distorted, like it was coming from an old radio. Her hands trembled as she dropped the remote onto the couch. Her heart pounded loudly in her chest. The man blinked. Once, then twice. Then, his head tilted to the side at an odd angle, too sharp to be natural. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. The screen cut to black. Emma gasped. The room was silent except for her own ragged breathing. She reached for her phone on the coffee table, her fingers shaking as she tried to unlock it. Before she could dial, the TV flickered back on. The man was still there, but now he was closer. His face filled the entire screen, his dark eyes staring straight at her. His mouth twitched as if he wanted to speak again, but no words came out. The static around him grew louder, buzzing like insects. Emma's hands felt numb. This wasn't possible. This had to be some kind of prank or a weird broadcast glitch. The man's mouth moved again, but his voice didn't match the movement. It was delayed, choppy, and distorted. "I see you," he finally said. Emma stood up so fast that her blanket fell to the floor. She grabbed the TV's power cord and yanked it out of the socket. The screen went dark. Silence filled the room. Emma took a deep breath. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe her mind was playing tricks on her. She sat back down, trying to steady her breathing. Then, a sound, a soft hum, a flickering light. The TV turned back on by itself. Emma's eyes widened in horror. The man was still there, even closer now, as if he was pressing his face against the screen. His voice was clearer this time. "Am coming," he whispered. Emma dropped her phone. Her entire body felt frozen in fear. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't a glitch. Something was very, very wrong. A slow, scraping sound echoed through the room. She turned her head toward the hallway. The bedroom door, which had been slightly open, creaked wider. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't alone. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone again. She had to call someone, anyone. But as she lifted the device, she saw something in the reflection of the screen. A shadow. Behind her. She spun around, heart hammering. Nothing. The room was empty. Then, a whisper, right next to her ear. "Don't turn around." Emma screamed, jumping off the couch. She ran to the light switch, flicking it on. The room flooded with brightness. She looked around wildly, searching for anything, anyone. Nothing was there. The TV was off again. The power cord still lay unplugged on the floor. Tears pricked at Emma's eyes. She backed up slowly toward the door, grabbing her keys. She needed to get out, needed to breathe fresh air, needed to be anywhere but here. As she reached for the doorknob, the TV screen flickered on one last time. The man was gone, but the static remained. And in its distorted waves, she saw something else, something worse. A reflection, her own face. And behind her, standing in the darkness, a figure with sunken eyes and a cracked smile. The screen went black. Emma never screamed, because by then, she was already gone. The hidden tape Ben had always loved horror movies. Ever since he was a kid, he enjoyed sitting in the dark, watching old black and white films about ghosts, monsters, and haunted houses. But what he loved even more was collecting old VHS tapes. He liked the way they looked, the way they felt in his hands, and even the way they smelled, like dust and time. While most people had moved on to DVDs and streaming, Ben spent his weekends searching thrift stores and flea markets for forgotten tapes. One Saturday afternoon, Ben visited an old thrift store on the edge of town. It was a small, cluttered shop filled with everything from old clothes to antique furniture. He made his way to the back, where a few shelves held stacks of VHS tapes. Most were ordinary, classic horror films, action movies, and cartoons. But then, something caught his eye. A single, dusty tape sat alone on the bottom shelf. It had no cover, just a plain black case with a piece of yellowed masking tape stuck to the front. Someone had written 3 words in shaky, faded letters. "Do not watch." Ben felt a chill, but excitement rushed through him. He had seen plenty of strange and rare tapes before, but never one like this. Who would write such a thing? Was it a prank? A lost movie? He had to know. He took the tape to the counter. The old woman behind the register barely glanced at it as she rang it up. "That'll be $1, she said. Ben paid, stuffed the tape into his backpack, and hurried home. That night, Ben sat in his dimly lit living room, the tape in his hands. He hesitated for a moment. What if there was something disturbing on it? But that only made him more curious. He slid the tape into his VCR and pressed play. The screen flickered to life, showing a grainy home video. A family sat around a dinner table, eating. There was a mother, a father, and 2 children, a boy and a girl. They seemed normal at first, chatting and laughing. But something felt off. The room was too quiet. The way they moved was slightly unnatural, as if they weren't real. Then, all at once, they stopped eating. Slowly, their heads turned toward the camera. Their faces were frozen in wide, unnatural smiles. Their eyes didn't blink. They didn't move. They just stared. Ben's stomach tightened. He reached for the remote and fast-forwarded. The screen flickered, and suddenly the scene changed. Now, the camera showed a dark hallway. The only sound was the faint creaking of the floor. Footsteps echoed, slow and steady. The camera panned, showing a door at the end of the hall. The door was slightly open, revealing only darkness inside. A whisper came from the TV. "He's watching." Ben's heart pounded. He paused the tape and rubbed his arms, trying to shake off the cold feeling creeping over him. "It's just an old tape," he told himself. "Probably a student film or some weird art project." But he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. He pressed play again. The camera moved, turning slowly toward a TV screen in the corner of the dark room. The screen showed a reflection. A man was standing there, his back to the camera. Ben leaned forward. The man turned around. Ben's breath caught in his throat. The man in the reflection looked exactly like him. His own face, his own clothes, his own wide, terrified eyes staring back at him through the screen. Ben's hands shook as he grabbed the remote and pressed stop. The screen went black. He took a deep breath and reached for the tape, ready to eject it. But then, the TV flickered back on. The video was still playing, but the tape wasn't in the VCR anymore. Ben froze. The screen showed the same dark hallway, the same slow footsteps. The same whisper. He's watching. Panic surged through him. He yanked the power cord from the wall. The TV screen should have gone black. It didn't. The video kept playing. A new scene appeared. The camera was now in a living room. A couch. A coffee table. A TV screen. Ben's living room. His couch. His coffee table. His TV. Ben's breath came in short gasps. He turned around slowly, his eyes darting to the corners of his dimly lit apartment. He was alone. But on the screen, the camera was moving, as if someone was inside his home, filming. Then the camera tilted downward. It showed Ben, sitting exactly where he was sitting right now. Terror gripped him. He grabbed the remote, pressing every button, but the screen wouldn't change. The camera on the TV moved closer, as if something was approaching him. A new whisper, right behind him. He's here. Ben spun around. The screen went black. Silence. He stood frozen, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. His apartment was quiet. Too quiet. The tape was gone. The TV was off. But Ben knew he wasn't alone. And somewhere, in the dark, something was still watching. The mysterious broadcast. Liam was home alone, curled up on his couch, watching the evening news. It was a quiet night, just him and the steady hum of the television. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, rattling the windows every now and then. The news was the same as always. Politics, weather, sports. Liam wasn't really paying attention. He was just passing the time before bed. But then, the screen flickered. For a second, the picture wobbled, and the sound cut off. Liam frowned. His internet had been fine all day. He tapped the remote, trying to change the channel, but nothing worked. The screen flashed again, and suddenly, the news anchors were gone. In their place was a grainy, black and white video. A dark road stretched out on the screen. The picture was old, with static lines running through it. At first, Liam thought it was some kind of old documentary, but then he noticed the date in the corner. 10 years ago. His stomach tightened. That wasn't right. Why would an old video suddenly play on the news? He leaned forward. Then, he saw her. A woman stood in the middle of the road, wearing a torn dress. Her hair hung over her face, long and messy. She didn't move. She just stood there, staring at what? Liam couldn't tell. A chill ran down his spine. He knew that road. It was close to his house, not even 10 minutes away. The video zoomed in. The woman's face remained blurry, but her lips were moving. She was saying something. Liam turned up the volume, but there was no sound. Then, words appeared on the screen. Don't let her in. A sharp knock echoed through Liam's apartment. He jumped, his heart pounding. The sound was loud, firm, right at his front door. Slowly, he turned his head toward the door. His mind raced. Who would be knocking at this hour? He wasn't expecting anyone. Another knock. His hands felt cold and clammy as he picked up his phone. No new messages. No missed calls. He hesitated, then stood up. He tiptoed toward the door and peeked through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway outside was empty. The dim light flickered slightly, but no one was there. Liam swallowed hard. Maybe it had been his imagination. Maybe a neighbor had knocked by mistake. But then, he turned back to the TV. The woman was closer. His breath caught in his throat. She hadn't moved before. The video had been still. But now, she was closer to the screen, her head tilted slightly, as if she could see him. The words on the screen changed. "She's here." A shiver ran down Liam's spine. The doorbell rang. Liam stumbled backward, his hands shaking. He stared at the TV, then at the door. His instinct screamed at him not to open it. Another knock. Harder this time. He pressed himself against the wall, his mind racing. Should he call the police? Tell them what? That a woman from a creepy old video was outside his door? They'd think he was crazy. The knocking continued. It was rhythmic now, a steady beat against the wood. Liam's breathing grew shallow. He didn't dare move. He didn't dare speak. Then, as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. Silence filled the room. Even the wind outside seemed to have disappeared. Liam waited, his heart pounding. He didn't know how long he stood there. 5 minutes. 10? Maybe more. Finally, he let out a shaky breath and turned back to the TV. The screen was black. Just a faint static noise hummed from the speakers. He grabbed the remote and turned it off. Then, cautiously, he walked toward the door and pressed his ear against it. Nothing. No footsteps. No movement. Maybe whoever it was had given up. Maybe it was just some weird prank. But then, he noticed something. A shadow under the door. His breath hitched. The hallway light was dim, but there was definitely a shadow. Someone was still standing there. Liam didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, the shadow shifted, moved away. His body felt frozen, trapped between fear and curiosity. He didn't dare check. He didn't want to know. He backed away slowly, step by step, until he was sitting on his couch again. For the rest of the night, he didn't turn the TV back on. He didn't open the door. He just sat there, listening to the silence. By morning, when the sun finally rose, everything seemed normal again. But his TV never worked again, and he never walked down that road again. The show that watched back, Sophie loved babysitting. She had been doing it for a few years now, and most of the time, it was easy. The kids would go to bed, and she would have the whole house to herself. She could do homework, watch TV, or scroll through her phone. Tonight was no different. She was watching over a little boy named Liam. His parents had left around 7 p.m., telling her they would be back late. Liam was a quiet kid, around 6 years old, with big blue eyes and messy blonde hair. He had been excited about his bedtime story, but after that, he fell asleep quickly. Now, Sophie was alone in the living room. The house was big and old, with wooden floors that creaked when she walked. The furniture was old-fashioned, and there were paintings on the walls, portraits of people she didn't recognize. Their eyes seemed to follow her, but she told herself it was just her imagination. She turned on the TV and flipped through the channels. Nothing interesting was on, just the usual talk shows, game shows, and news. Then she stopped. One channel was playing an old cartoon. She didn't recognize it. The colors were dull, and the animation was odd. The characters moved strangely, almost like they were puppets. Their eyes were dark and empty, like holes in their faces. Sophie frowned. She had watched a lot of cartoons growing up, but this one didn't look familiar. It didn't even seem finished, like it had been drawn by someone who didn't know what they were doing. Something about it made her feel uneasy. She grabbed the remote and turned the TV off. For a second, the screen stayed black, and she let out a breath of relief. But then, suddenly, the TV turned back on by itself. The cartoon was still playing, but something was different. The characters, those strange, empty-eyed figures, were now staring straight at her. A message scrolled across the bottom of the screen. "You're in the show now." Sophie's stomach twisted. She looked around the room, half expecting someone to jump out and say it was a prank. But the house was quiet. Liam was still asleep upstairs. She looked back at the TV. The background of the cartoon had changed. It wasn't just a random setting anymore. It was a house. The exact house she was babysitting in. Her heart pounded. She recognized the furniture, the paintings, even the creaky wooden floor. It was all there, drawn in the same creepy style as the rest of the cartoon. Then she heard it. A loud knock. It came from upstairs. Sophie froze. Liam was the only one up there. Had he woken up? Was he knocking on the wall? She slowly stood up, keeping her eyes on the TV. The cartoon had changed again. The screen now showed a hallway. A dark hallway. Her breath caught in her throat. It was the hallway inside the house. The same hallway upstairs, where Liam's room was. On the screen, a shadowy figure stepped forward. It was moving slowly, creeping toward a door. The door to Liam's room. Sophie's hands were shaking. She didn't want to look away from the screen, but she had to check on Liam. She took slow steps toward the staircase. And then, the sound of a doorknob turning. Not from the TV, from right behind her.